Welcome to a truly boring history, a soft-spoken journey through the forgotten corners of the past. Tonight, we'll quietly step into another bleak chapter of history, told not with excitement, but with quiet honesty. If you're just settling in for a peaceful listen before sleep, we'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. And if this kind of slow, haunting historical storytelling helps you unwind, don't forget to subscribe for more quietly unsettling tales of muddy paths, crooked ends, and a long, lonely danger of the medieval road. They called them roads, but they were nothing like what we imagine today. There was no stone beneath your feet, no lines to follow, and rarely any sign that someone had been there before you. What people in the Middle Ages considered a road was often no more than a flattened stretch of dirt, carved by hose, wheels, and the occasional barefoot traveler. And even those paths didn't last. The moment it rained, the road became a river of mud, thick, cold, and slow. When it snowed, the road disappeared entirely. In summer, it turned to choking dust. In between, it was often indistinguishable from the fields or the forests that surrounded it. Maps were rare. Signposts even rarer. If you didn't know where you were going, the road wouldn't help you. It didn't guide. It didn't care. And it was always changing. Merchants, messengers, pilgrims, and soldiers all walked these roads, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. There were no real alternatives. The sea was dangerous. The forests were darker, and the towns were too few and far between. So they trudged through the roads, if they could be called that, carrying goods on their backs or driving wagons that groaned under the weight of grain, cloth, or iron. The wheels would sink into the soft earth. Animals would collapse. And people would vanish. Roads were not fixed things in this time. They were not built. They happened, and then they unhappened, swallowed again by nature when no one walked them for long enough. Villagers often refused to leave their homes precisely because of the roads. Every journey was a gamble. You might reach your destination. You might die in a ditch. Or worse, you might vanish, and no one would ever know where or how or why. There were no patrols, no markers. If you fell and broke a leg, no one would find you. If you were robbed, no one would care. The road made no promises. It simply stretched forward, uneven and uncaring. And yet, people still used it. Because in a world where travel was pain, stillness was poverty. The road was awful, but it was necessary. And so they walked. Through the mud and dust, past crumbling bridges and over shallow streams that froze in winter and flooded in spring. Some built makeshift planks with wood, laying them over swamps to form a path that wouldn't suck off your boots. Others carried long sticks to test the ground ahead, but most just endured. And over time, they learned not to expect the road to help them. They carried everything they needed, food, water, hope, on their own backs. Because they understood something we have forgotten. The road does not serve you. You serve it. And as you move further from the safety of stone walls and guarded gates, the road grew stranger. The trees leaned closer. The wind grew colder. And every bend became a question you weren't sure you wanted answered. Still, you kept walking. Because behind you was hunger, and ahead of you was a hope, however faint, of something better. But every step into the unknown meant less shelter, less light, and fewer people who might care whether you lived or died. And if you kept walking long enough, you would find something far worse than bad weather or bad roads. You would find other people who didn't want to be found. They stood in the shadows where the trees crowded the edge of the path, where the birds stopped singing and the wind shifted direction. Sometimes they were silent, letting your imagination do most of the work. Other times they whistled low, short, deliberate sounds that didn't belong to any bird. These were not travelers. They had no wagons, no loads, no destination. They had only patience and knives. These were the ones who made their living from those foolish enough or desperate enough to walk the road alone. They called them footpads or cut purses or simply the lads in the trees. Some were former soldiers, trained to kill but paid no longer. Others were outlaws, stripped of land and name. Many were simply men who had nothing, and decided they'd rather take than ask. They didn't want your life, at least not at first. They wanted your boots. your bread, the silver buckle on your belt, the coin hidden in the hem of your shirt. They could spot a coin pouch by the way your cloak shifted when you walked. And if they thought you carried more than you needed, they would step into the road, say nothing, and raise a rusted blade that didn't have to be sharp, just close enough to your throat. Sometimes they let you go after they took everything. Sometimes they didn't. There were stories told in whispers at village hearths of travelers found stripped and frozen, mouths full of mud, their bags turned inside out beside them. And there were other stories, less spoken, of those who disappeared entirely, swallowed by the road and its nameless inhabitants. No one asked too many questions, because no one wanted to hear the answers. Even merchants, who often traveled with guards, weren't safe. The road was long. Guards slept, or drank, or were bribed. And sometimes, the very people paid to protect you turned and held out their hand for more. That was the danger of the road. It wasn't just wild animals and weather. It was people. Desperate, quiet, clever people. People who knew that there were no laws between towns. No judges among the trees. Only survival. Some bandits worked alone. Others formed loose groups, ragged brotherhoods that lived in forest huts and ruined towers. They shared stolen bread and whispered strategies by firelight. They didn't call themselves thieves. They had names, loyalties, codes. They believed they were owed what they took, that the rich deserved to lose, that the road was theirs to control. And perhaps it was, because no one else controlled it. No lord, no king, no priest. Only those willing to stand in the cold, in the silence, and wait. Travelers learned to recognize the signs. Fresh boot prints that didn't match their own. A piece of cloth snagged on a low branch. A sudden quiet where birds had been. And most of all, the feeling, that weight behind your ribs, like breath you forgot to take. They called it the road's warning. If you were lucky, you'd turn around in time. If not, the road took its price. And yet, people still walked it. Because they had to. Because the only thing worse than being robbed was starving slowly in the same place you were born. So they prayed. They packed light. And they looked over their shoulder until the sun set. Then they found a place to hide. Because only a fool walked the road after dark. But even in daylight, the danger never truly left. You could smell it sometimes, sweat, iron, smoke from a fire that shouldn't have been burning. Or hear it, a cough in the woods, a boot scraping stone. And then, if you were fast, you ran. If you were lucky, you weren't followed. But luck was a rare thing on the medieval road. But even if no one waited in the trees, the road could still destroy you, because it was never dry for long. The skies in medieval Europe were unreliable companions, gray more often than blue, heavy with water, unpredictable. A morning that began clear could end in downpour, and once it rained, the road stopped being a path. It became a trap. Carriages would sink axle deep in the muck. Horses panicked, slipped, and sometimes broke their legs, only to be abandoned where they fell. Travelers lost shoes, carts lost wheels, and people lost their nerve. The mud was not simply mud. It was rot. It was runoff from nearby fields, refuse from passing herds, waste tossed in the backs of wagons, and blood from butchered animals. It seeped into wounds, ruined supplies, and clung to the hems of robes like an unwelcome shadow. No one stayed clean. The smell was sour and constant. When you stopped to sleep, if you found a dry place at all, it stuck to your skin, to your bedding, to your breath. Sometimes the rain didn't fall in sheets. Sometimes it just lingered in the air, a fine mist that coated everything in cold. Fog moved in behind it, slow and dense, blurring the edges of the world until the road itself disappeared. Then came the accidents. The wheel that slipped into a ditch. The step off a slope you didn't see. The sudden twist of an ankle. And there were no warnings. No fences. No guardrails. Just the dull realization that you were no longer upright. Then pain. Then silence. People were swallowed by these roads. Not metaphorically. Not romantically. Literally. There were stories of entire ox carts disappearing into sinkholes. Wheels, animals, men, all gone in a moment, buried in wet earth. Days later, a boot might resurface. Or a sack of barley, now soaked and useless. but usually nothing returned. The road simply closed over what had taken, as if it had always been that way. In drier months, the dust offered no mercy either. It rose in clouds that burned the eyes and coated the tongue. It masked potholes and deep ruts that could twist a knee or snap a bone. It gathered in the lungs, making every breath feel like you were swallowing the road itself. And in both extremes, mud or dust, blisters formed, joints swelled, skin cracked. The road wore people down not with drama, but with persistence. There was no comfort, no in every few miles, no shelters, unless you counted abandoned barns or the leeward side of a rock. Even trees, which might offer shade or coverage, could be dangerous, hiding both wild animals and those who meant you harm. So travelers trudged forward, heads down, steps careful, always wet, always cold, always tired. The rain also brought floods. Streams became rivers. Bridges vanished beneath churning water. What was a short cross in the week before became a death trap now. If you tried to cross, the current could take your cart, your supplies, your child. There were no warning signs. Only water where there used to be land. And if you waited for the flood to recede, you might run out of food before the road returned. Worse still were the places where the road simply ended. It had once connected two villages, perhaps, or led to a market town that had since burned or emptied. But now it stopped in the middle of the woods, overgrown and sunken, as if no one had ever passed that way. The maps, if you had one, didn't tell you that. They didn't warn you of how quickly a path could vanish when no one cared to maintain it. But people still walked because they had no other choice. They accepted the cold. They accepted the risk. Because on the other side of the road, there was a chance, however small, of work, of safety, of food. So they stepped into the mud, into the mist, into the uncertain, shifting earth, and hoped it wouldn't be their turn to disappear. And if the road in daylight was cruel, it became something else entirely when night fell. The same muddy ruts, the same broken branches, the same uncertain paths. All of them vanished into a deeper, colder darkness. There were no lamps to guide your way, no streetlights, no signs. Only the moon, if it happened to be full, and your own fear, which often glowed brighter than any torch could. Most travelers made it a rule never to walk after sunset, not because the dangers changed, but because they became invisible in the dark. Sound carried farther, but meaning was lost. A branch snapping behind you could be an animal or a thief or nothing at all. You would never know until it was too late. The rustle of leaves could be the wind, or feet moving slowly, deliberately. In daylight, you had at least the illusion of control. At night, you were no more than a silhouette moving through someone else's territory. But not everyone had the luxury of stopping. Some journeys were urgent, some were delayed, some were simply miscalculated. And so, now and then, a traveler would find themselves still walking long after the last color had drained from the sky. That's when the road felt longest, when time seemed to stretch between each footfall. The cold crept into your bones not just from the wind, but from the sense that you were being watched, not by one person, but by many, and not always by the living. Villagers told stories, of course, of phantoms along the roadside, spirits of travelers who had died with unfinished errands, or who had been murdered and buried in shallow graves. Some claimed to have seen pale figures standing at crossroads, offering directions that led only deeper into the woods. Others heard whispers behind them, too soft to understand, but too persistent to ignore. Whether these were memories, hallucinations, or something else didn't really matter. What mattered was how alone you felt. Even when you were sure someone or something was following. If you carried a lantern, the flame often attracted more than it repelled. Insects, yes, but also people, the hungry, the desperate, the cruel. Light was a signal that someone was out there, perhaps vulnerable, perhaps unarmed. So some travelers chose to walk without it, stumbling in the dark, hands outstretched, praying with each step that they wouldn't trip over a root or a body or the edge of a ravine. Animals, too, emerged after dark. Wolves were feared most, but in truth, they rarely attacked unless desperate. Wild dogs, though, scavengers grown bold by starvation, moved in packs, and watched from a distance. Owls called, foxes darted, and sometimes, deep in the distance, came the low groan of something that wasn't quite human. The road at night had its own sounds, its own language. If you listened too hard, it changed you. Some people tried to sleep beside the road when darkness fell, but that was no real rest. The ground was hard, wet and cold. The wind found every gap in your blanket. And even if your body stilled, your mind kept walking, listening, waiting. If you slept, you dreamed. And the road followed you there, too. Only a few dared to build fires, and even fewer dared to speak above a whisper. Talking too loudly felt like an invitation, as if the road might answer back. And no one wanted to hear what it had to say. So the night passed slowly, minute by minute, with no sense of progress, only survival. And when the sky began to lighten again, when the black gave way to gray and the trees began to show their shapes once more, travelers rose not with relief, but with resignation, because the road hadn't changed in the dark. But they had. And as they stood, brushed the damp from their cloaks, and stepped once again onto the path ahead, they knew that even in daylight, they would carry the night with them, like a shadow they couldn't shake. And so they walked, still haunted by the night, into a world that barely looked different by day. The trees loomed just the same, the road still narrow and broken, and the way forward just as uncertain. There were no milestones to count, no arrows pointing the right direction, no markers carved helpfully into trees. Even the notion of a straight path was laughable. A road might fork suddenly into three, each way identical in its silence and disrepair. And the truth was, most people didn't carry maps. Not because they forgot, but because they never had one to begin with. Maps were for kings and generals, scholars and churchmen. They were painted on vellum, locked in scriptoria, and filled with sea monsters and symbolic trees. To the average traveler, they were as useful as prayers muttered into the wind. Even those who could read, an uncommon skill, couldn't rely on a map to show what mattered. No map showed where the bandits camped. No map told you which bridge had collapsed last spring, or which town would turn you away if you looked too poor or too foreign or too sick. Instead, people relied on word of mouth, passed from farmhand to merchant, from monk to mule driver. Directions were always vague, and always assumed that you already knew half the way. Keep east past the dead elm, they'd say, or turn where the path narrows between the two stones. But the elm had fallen years ago. The stones were covered in moss, and east was no help when the clouds of the sun and every direction felt the same. So they asked at inns, if they found one. They asked shepherds in the fields, or woodcutters by the roadside. They asked with caution, because asking too many questions made you look unprepared, and the road did not reward the unready. The wise traveler memorized landmarks, the shape of a particular tree, the smell of nearby marsh, the distant sound of a bell tower on clear days. Travel was as much about listening as walking. There were those who made a living guiding others. Not official guides. There were no licenses or odes, but wanderers who knew certain stretches of road well. For a few coins or half a loaf of bread, they'd walk with you a while. Sometimes they were helpful. Sometimes they weren't. Some disappeared at the first sign of trouble. Others led you in circles until you were more lost than before. And some led you straight into a trap. But even with guidance, there was only so much you could do. The landscape changed constantly. A store might uproot a landmark tree. A new lord might claim a field and fence it off. A town you passed through last year might have burned or been abandoned or renamed. Roads shifted like rivers, not in a day, but over seasons, over years. And those who knew them well grew old or died, taking their knowledge with them. Each journey was new, even if you'd walked it before. There was a kind of humility in this, an acceptance that no matter how much you prepared, the road would still surprise you. The act of walking was a conversation with the unknown, 1 foot at a time. You learned to read the road not with your eyes, but with your instincts. A worn path here, a faint groove in the grass there, a sense of where others had passed, and where they had not. And always, there was a fear of going the wrong way, because the wrong road didn't always look wrong. It looked quiet, peaceful even, until you noticed the silence was too deep. until the woods closed in tighter, until the air turned still and heavy, as if it didn't want you there. By then, it was often too late to turn back, so they kept walking, without maps, without signs, with nothing but memory and caution to guide them, because the road wasn't something you mastered. It was something you survived. And as the road wandered further into unfamiliar lands, the greatest danger wasn't always the men in the shadows. Sometimes, the most dangerous people didn't hide at all. They stood in plain sight, wore smiles instead of hoods, and asked for what they wanted instead of taking it by force, at least at first. These were the toll keepers, the corrupt watchmen, the self-appointed lords of forgotten stretches of earth. They didn't leap from behind trees. They waited beside rickety bridges, crossroads, or crumbling watchtowers, collecting coin for the right to pass, or inventing reasons to take what they pleased. They called it duty. They called it protection. But what it meant was payment, extracted from anyone who looked too poor to resist and too far from home to complain. A cart full of apples? That meant a spoilage fee. A barrel of salted fish? Clearly subject to river-crossing tax. If you carried gold openly, they'd assume you had more hidden. If you carried none, they'd assume you lied. There was no arguing, no receipts, just cold eyes and the slow motion of a sword being drawn from its sheath if you hesitated too long. Sometimes these men had the blessing of local lords, who turned a blind eye as long as their cut arrived on time. Other times, they were bandits who had claimed a piece of the road and enforced it with enough violence to make it law. Travelers learned to carry two purses, one with a few sad coins, to surrender quickly, and another hidden away in the lining of a cloak. But even that wasn't always enough. If you looked like you had anything to lose, they would search you. If they found something hidden, they'd accuse you of deceit and punish you on the spot. Women were particularly vulnerable. Alone or not, young or old, it didn't matter. Their safety rested not in laws but in luck or the mercy of the men they encountered. Some disguised themselves as boys. Others traveled in silence, heads down, refusing to make eye contact. But the road was a hungry thing, and the men who fed on it were not easily satisfied. In towns, it was no better. The thieves, their war robes, carried seals and spoke in a language of bureaucracy. Traveling merchants were often stopped at the gates and made to pay invented fines for imagined offenses, mismeasured goods, unlicensed trade, suspicion of smuggling. None of it mattered. What mattered was that you were a stranger, and strangers had no voice. Even the inns, those places travelers clung to in memory as islands of warmth, could be traps. Some innkeepers were honest. Many were not. They'd water your ale, then charge you for drunkenness. They'd short you on bread, then fine you for complaining. If your boots were stolen in the night, they'd shrug and say you must have walked in barefoot. And if you didn't wake up at all, if your drink had been too heavy or your food too strange, well, accidents happen on the road all the time. So travelers learned to trust slowly, if at all. They memorized faces, listened for dialects, watched how coins were counted. They paid a little extra for stabling horses away from main roads or for beds near doors. They shared food with those who looked hungriest in hopes of kindness later. And they always kept one eye on the road, even when they slept, because the worst thieves didn't need to steal in the dark. They took from you in the light, with words instead of weapons, and a smile that promised safety just long enough to disarm you. And still, the road stretched on, winding like a promise that no one believed but everyone followed. The next village, the next trade fair, the next rumor of work. And just beyond the bend, a little more of your strength would be spent, if not by the road itself, then by those who had learned how to profit from it. And so, in response to the road's unending cruelties, some travelers did what they could appear less vulnerable. Merchants, especially those carrying valuable goods, often paid for guards, men with weapons, hardened eyes, and the kind of posture that warned would-be thieves to think twice. These small caravans looked, at first glance, like bastions of security, armored escorts riding beside laden wagons, watching the trees, inspecting every face at every fork in the path. But what they really offered was not safety, only the illusion of it, because most guards were not soldiers. They were hired men, often only one step removed from the very bandits they were meant to fight off. Some had once been highway robbers themselves, now bought into legitimacy by silver. Some were deserters from old wars, willing to carry a spear again for the price of bread. Loyalty in this world was rarely guaranteed. The road did not pay well, and hunger had a way of making men reconsider their contracts. At night, these guards slept, and when they did not, they drank. And when they drank, they gambled or argued or fell into silence, so deep it almost dared trouble to wake them. And if something happened, if a shadow moved where it shouldn't, or a voice called out in warning, they reacted slowly, if at all, because danger on the road was constant, and the more you saw it, the less you jumped at its approach. The merchants themselves, burdened by both wealth and worry, tried to organize their journeys carefully. They chose well-traveled routes when possible, timed their movements with seasonal fairs, paid priests for blessings before departure. Some even hired scribes to keep records of every toll, every item traded, every hand shaken. But none of it could stop a well-laid ambush, or a sudden collapse of a bridge, or the sickness of a single ox that brought an entire wagon to a halt. And when things went wrong, and they often did, the guards could do little more than draw steel and hope it was enough, because the bandits knew these roads better. They knew where the ground softened just enough to mire a cart. They knew which turns left you surrounded. They knew which hills gave the best view of approaching dust clouds, and which ravines were deep enough to hide bodies no one would come looking for. Some caravans never made it. Others returned, limping, lighter than they left, not in goods, but in people. A guard who vanished during a midnight watch. A cook who went to fetch water and never came back. A merchant who refused to hand over his coin and paid with a slit throat. Face pressed into the mud while the others kept their eyes down. And those who survived learned not to speak of it. The silence was practical. It avoided panic. But it was also something deeper, an acknowledgement that the road had its own rules, and speaking too loudly about what it took might remind it to take again. But still, others watched these guarded groups with envy, to walk with companions, to hear footsteps that were not your own, to sleep in a circle instead of curl behind a stump. That was a luxury. A dangerous one, yes, but a luxury nonetheless. Even the smallest illusion of safety was better than none at all. And so the road filled, little by little, with groups bound together by necessity more than trust. Pilgrims walked alongside smugglers. Out-of-work masons followed spice traders. No one asked too many questions, and no one lingered long when the group disbanded. Companionship was a temporary armor, discarded when its weight became inconvenient. Because in the end, every journey on the medieval road returned to one truth. You could hire strength, you could buy protection, you could surround yourself with men and weapons and prayers, but no one, not even the best prepared, ever truly felt safe. And where force failed to tame the road, faith tried. In the great empty stretches between towns, where trees pressed in silence stretched for miles, the church planted its presence. Crosses hammered into dirt, roadside shrines tucked beneath leaning trees, and occasionally chapels built of damp stone, their roofs moss-covered and slanted with age. These were not places of grandeur or splendor. They were stations of pause, beacons of spiritual refuge, and, for some, a last hope. Crossroads were a special concern. They were the places where choices had to be made, where paths forked without promise of return. In the minds of medieval travelers, crossroads were places of spiritual vulnerability, thin places where the living world brushed too close to something older, deeper, less merciful. And so, the church laid claim to them. A wooden crucifix raised on a mound of stones. A carving of St. Christopher nailed to a tree. Sometimes, a candle burned beside a rough stone altar, half melted and soggy from rain. People stopped here not only to rest their feet, but to pray for direction, not metaphorically, but literally. Because a wrong turn might lead not to delay, but to death. A single misstep at a crossroad could send you days off course, to a village where plague had emptied the houses, or a river without a crossing, or worse, into the lands of a rival lord whose soldiers had no patience for travelers without cause. The priests who tended these places were rarely what one imagined. They were not cloaked in gold or surrounded by choirs. They were men who had chosen or been exiled to the edge of the known world. Their sermons were mumbled, their robes patched, their eyes tired, and yet they held a kind of quiet power. For when a man knelt in the mud beside a shrine, whispering prayers with cold fingers and empty stomach, it was not to be saved from sin. It was to make it one more day. In some cases, these crossroads became centers for small markets. Locals brought root vegetables, rough cheese, and firewood to sell to passers-by. Information was traded. Too, news of floods, bandits, or royal decrees. But just as often, these places were empty. The market had moved. The priest had died. The shrine had crumbled. And all that remained was the sound of wind through bare branches and a distant cry of a bird no one could name. And even the church could not cleanse every shadow. Some said that the most dangerous men disguised themselves in borrowed robes, posing as monks to lure the desperate into false sanctuary. Others said the spirits of those who died unblessed still lingered at certain forks in the road, muttering curses at those who passed too quickly. Whether true or not, the fear shaped the behavior of those who traveled. Most would leave a coin at a shrine, however poor they were. Some left bread. A few left nothing, but they always walked a little faster afterward, as if chased by the way of their own ingratitude. The church, for all its influence, did not build roads. It did not patrol them. It could not guarantee safety. But it understood, in its own way, that the road was a kind of pilgrimage for everyone, not just the devout. And in placing its symbols at these uncertain places, it tried to whisper into the chaos, "You are not alone." But the road, ancient and unmoved, did not answer. And though the road offered no kindness, it never traveled empty. It carried not only travelers and their burdens, but sickness. Quietly, invisibly, inevitably, illness moved faster than carts and clung tighter than cloaks. It lived in the water drawn from shallow ditches. It nestled in the shared cups at roadside inns. It bloomed in wounds left unwashed and breathed to the mouths of the weary, the cold, the hungry. No one called it by one name. Sometimes it was the fever. Sometimes it was the rot. Sometimes it had no name at all, just a silence that spread after someone coughed too hard or failed to rise after sleep. And it followed the road like a shadow that stretched longer with each mile. A single infected man might pass through 3 towns before the pain truly began. But by then, the wells were already poisoned with his breath, the blankets already shared, the hands already shaken. Merchants were blamed, often unfairly. Pilgrims, too. Anyone who passed from one place to another was seen as a carrier of bad air and bad luck. Villages sometimes refused entry to travelers entirely, forcing them to sleep in fields outside stone walls, watched by guards who dared not speak to them, but also would not let them leave until dawn. Some towns required a clean letter from a priest or noble, a worthless document stating that the bearer had shown no signs of plague. But by the time symptoms showed, it was always too late. On the road, medicine was a word whispered, not practiced. Most travelers had no knowledge of herbs, and those who did rarely cared enough to be useful. A sprig of yarrow, a pouch of dried thyme, but no cure. When someone grew pale or began to sweat, the others walked faster, not out of cruelty but out of fear. To linger near sickness was to invite it into your own lungs. If a man fell behind, coughing blood, he was often left without ceremony, not buried, not blessed, just abandoned beside the road, where his body would sink slowly into the dirt, claimed first by flies, then by silence. And yet, there were those who kept walking long after their bodies had begun to fail. Eyes sunken, lips cracked, sweat pouring from beneath their cloaks. Driven by something stronger than pain, need, or perhaps guilt, they stumbled forward, infecting every place they touched, not because they wished to harm, but because the road did not offer rest, only movement. To stop was to die. And so they moved, spreading sickness not with malice, but with breath. The road itself bore the signs. Blood dried into dust at the edges of ruts, bedding left behind, soaked and stiff with illness. Crude symbols carved into trees to warn those who followed. Death here. Keep moving. But few could afford to turn back. The same road that carried disease also carried grain, and coins, and letters from one lord to another. And if it stopped, everything stopped. Some blamed the weather, others blamed sin. But the truth was simpler. The road was a bloodstream, and the people upon it were cells. Some healthy, some already dying, all moving toward destinations that neither welcomed them nor understood what came with them. And so, sickness traveled with the travelers, silent and constant, like a second shadow behind each step. The road did not cause it, but it carried it faithfully from door to door, mile by mile. And for every mile a traveler passed, something was left behind, not always by choice. Sometimes a bundle fell unnoticed from the side of a cart, a sack tore, a coin slipped between fingers made numb by cold. But more often, what was lost along the road was not material. It was memory. It was people. It was the pieces of a life worn away by each day spent walking in silence through mud and fog and fear. The road collected these remnants. A child's shoe, too small now to fit even the smallest foot. A wooden comb snapped in two, its teeth rotting from rain. An unfinished letter never delivered. There were no hands to gather these things. No caretakers had forgotten. The road simply absorbed them, pushing them into the ditch, hiding them beneath moss, or leaving them half buried until time decided what stayed and what would vanish. Sometimes, what was left behind was a companion, a brother too sick to stand, a mule too lame to carry on, a friend who fell asleep and did not wake. These were not dramatic moments. There were no final words, no music, no prayers, only a quiet decision. One person stopped walking. The others didn't. The road did not allow for ceremonies. The road only moved forward. Some tried to mark the places. A pile of stones beside a tree. A cross carved into bark. But even these were swallowed. By weather. By moss. By time. What seemed sacred one day became just another part of the landscape the next. Most travelers stopped trying to remember the exact spots. Grief slowed the steps. And the road, unkind as ever, punished the slow. Even laughter was something left behind. In the early days of the journey, when spirits were high and feet still strong, there might be jokes, songs, even hope. But the further one went, the quieter it became. Words turned functional. Smiles grew rare. Even names, once shared around fires, were forgotten by the time the next village appeared on the horizon. What mattered was movement, not memory. And so, by the time a traveler reached their destination, if they reached it all, they were no longer the person who began the walk. The road had taken parts of them. Their patience, their warmth, sometimes their faith. They arrived smaller, in ways that couldn't be seen. And they carried new things, invisible but heavy. Suspicion, weariness, a way of glancing at shadows that never quite left. The road was not cruel for cruelty's sake. It simply demanded a toll. And what it asked for was not always measured in silver. It asked for what people could not afford to give, but gave anyway. Comfort, certainty, trust. And most of all, pieces of themselves. And so, step by step, the road became not just a path between places, but a graveyard of what had once been whole. And it went on, forever it seemed, waiting patiently for more travelers to pass, more bundles to fall, more memories to slip away unnoticed into the dust. And then, there were moments when the road didn't just take things from people. It took something deeper from the beasts that carried them. Mules, oxen, and horses were the true lifeblood of medieval travel. Pulling carts through swamps and frost, bearing burdens too great for human backs, enduring hunger and cold without protest, until they didn't, until the day came when the road reached a place so bleak, so broken, that even the animals stopped. It never happened with drama. There was no rearing, no great cry, no desperate charge into the trees. Instead, the mule would simply stop walking. Its ears would flick once, its eyes would go blank, and then it would plant its hooves into the ground and not move again, no matter how much you begged, no matter how much you pulled or promised or beat the earth around its feet. Something in the beast had recognized the truth before the human had. This part of the road was worse than what lay behind. Some said animals could smell death in the soil, that they could sense the remnants of old blood, of bones buried shallow, of suffering that had settled into the stones like a curse. Others believe it was simpler than that. That exhaustion had finally taken hold, that hunger had dug too deep, and that even a dumb creature knew when it had reached the end of what it could give. But it wasn't always exhaustion. There were places, hidden just beyond the next bend, where silence fell too quickly, where no bird sang, where even the wind didn't seem to pass through. These were the places where carts broke down without warning, where wheels cracked, where food spoiled faster, where men lost their way despite walking straight. And it was always in these places that animals stopped first. A horse would lower its head and refuse the bit. An ox would turn aside, pulling its yoke at an angle that made the cart groan. A donkey would simply lie down in the middle of the path, staring at nothing, breathing slowly, as if preparing for the end. And when that happened, the humans around them would go quiet. Because even if they didn't know why, they understood that something had shifted, that the road had changed in a way that maps and memory couldn't explain. Sometimes they waited. Sometimes they tried to coax the beast full with sugar or songs or prayers. But if the animal didn't rise again, there was only one choice left: to unhook it, leave it, and walk on. And those who did so carried that failure with them, even if they never spoke of it. Because abandoning an animal was not like losing a tool or a pack. It was like leaving behind a piece of your own body. It felt like betrayal, and it felt like warning. In the rare moments when the animal did recover, when it stood again or took one tentative step forward, it always moved differently afterward, as if it had glimpsed something beyond the trees that no human could see. And the travelers who followed its lead did so with silence, stepping lightly, eyes low, unwilling to disturb whatever had been stirred. The road remembered those stops. Long after the cart marks faded, long after the droppings turned to dust, the place where an animal had refused still held that pause in its bones. Later travelers might find themselves slowing without reason, glancing around without knowing why, feeling a tightness in the chest that wasn't fear exactly, but something close. And so, in time, people learned to trust their beasts more than their instincts. When a mule turned back, so did they. When a horse refused the saddle, they walked, because some parts of the road were older than memory and heavier than footsteps. And only those with hooves on the ground could truly tell when it was time to stop. And in places where the earth held too many secrets, the roads themselves seemed to whisper of the dead, not just the dead who had fallen on them, but those who had made them, because beneath many of the stones that paved the oldest paths, beneath the packed soil of Roman routes and forgotten tradeways, were the hands and bones of those who had built them, not masons in leather aprons, not craftsmen with pride in their work, but slaves, prisoners, the condemned. Their names were never carved in stone. They were never sung about in the halls of lords or listed in abbey records. They were conscripted by force, marched to remote places and told to move the earth, to quarry stone with wooden wedges, to haul gravel in bare hands, to break their backs laying paths that they themselves would never walk freely. And when they collapsed, when the body gave out from hunger, heat, or the crack of a taskmaster's whip, they were buried where they fell, covered over by the very road they had helped to build. There were legends, of course, travelers who claimed they heard voices beneath their feet, the sound of digging, or of low moans rising up from beneath the packed soil. Some said certain stretches of road never stayed dry, that the ground always wept after heavy rain, not with water, but with something thicker, darker, something that stained boots and never washed out. In places, the stones were laid too straight, too perfect, the symmetry unnatural in a world of wild hills and shifting land. These were the Roman roads, ancient even in the Middle Ages, and often avoided by the superstitious. They were too well built, too enduring, as if the cruelty that had shaped them had given them a kind of permanence that defied nature. Peasants said that walking these roads at night was a kind of invitation to madness or misfortune or both, not because of ghosts, but because of memory, because the very shape of the road reminded you that your comfort, your movement, was born of someone else's suffering, that every mile of smooth stone had once been paid for in blood. In certain places, old bones still surfaced after heavy rains. A jaw here, a hand there, bits of iron shackles that rusted in the grass. And no one knew what to do with them. The church might bury them if a priest happened by, but more often, They were left where they lay, covered again, forgotten again. And the irony was sharp, that roads built to bring armies, to move goods, to connect empire, now served mostly the desperate. It was not kings who walked them now, but peddlers with cracked feet, beggars with fading voices, mothers with children too tired to cry, all walking over the dead, who had once also been forced to march, forced to labor, and who now made up the very spine of the land beneath. So when the wind blew low and steady across those old, impossibly straight roads, it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like breath, like the exhale of thousands long buried, still beneath the weight of stone. And those who walked there, those who felt the strange stillness of perfectly level ground, often did so quickly, without stopping, because even the cruelest of living men understood, on some level, that these roads had not been given, they had been taken, and the debt had never truly been repaid. And when the cold crept into the bones and dusk blurred the edges of the road, every traveler looked for a door, any door that might open, a lantern's glow, the low murmur of voices, the wooden sign of a stag, or a crown hanging crooked above a heavy door. The tavern. That image burned into the tired imagination as the last fragile hope before nightfall. But not every inn welcomed the road-worn. Some taverns, especially those standing alone, distant from towns and villages, looked welcoming only from a distance. Inside, the air was thick not with warmth, but with suspicion. The fire burned low. The hearth watched more than shared. The barkeep met your gaze with eyes that asked questions you hadn't spoken. And the silence when you stepped in, soaked or shivering, was the worst part of all, as though your presence unbalanced something that had settled into uneasy stillness. These were the inns built not for comfort, but for necessity, places where the ale was soured, the bread stale, and the company colder than the weather, where the regulars did not look up from their mugs, or did so only long enough to measure the weight of your purse and the shape of your shoes. You sat, if you were brave, at a corner table with your back against the wall, and you listened more than you ate. The food was never offered. You had to ask, and even then it might arrive late, half-spoiled, as if made for someone else and passed down. A stew with too much bone, a crust that broke teeth, and the meat, always the meat, whose origin you didn't want to question. The upstairs rooms, if they existed at all, were narrow, dark, and windowless. The locks never worked. The blankets were damp, and some claimed the beds themselves remembered things. The weight of those who had not risen again. You slept fully clothed, with your pack under your head, and a knife near your hand, if you dared to sleep at all. And yet, even these unwelcoming places filled up quickly come nightfall, because outside the road was worse. Inside, you might be watched. Outside, you would be followed. Inside, you might be cheated. Outside, you might be taken. And so, between two evils, the traveler chose the one with a roof. Some taverns refused guests outright. A nailed door, a shutter closed just as you approached. A voice behind would saying, "We're full," even when the windows glowed with emptiness. And those were the most terrifying of all. Because if even that door stayed shut, it meant the people inside feared something more than they feared the curse of turning away the desperate. And there were whispers, always whispers, about certain inns where no one left. A man who drank one night and never rose. A woman whose horse was found still tied to the post 3 days later. Her saddle full of coins, her room empty. Places where the price of a bed was more than coin, and where the innkeeper's smile was just a delay before something worse. But still the road forced decisions. Your feet cracked, your legs ached. The fog rolled in like a closing fist. And when you saw the lantern swinging in the distance, even if your stomach twisted, you walked toward it. Because hope was not a choice. It was a reflex. And so, many nights ended behind unfamiliar doors, in rooms that smelled of mold and memory, with the road's damp breath still clinging to your clothes. You curled in on yourself. You listened to the sounds of others pretending not to listen. You waited for morning, not in rest, but in the fragile belief that daylight might mean movement again. Because on the road, you didn't stop to recover. You stopped to survive. And the taverns, whether they welcomed you or not, knew that truth better than anyone. And when the rain came, and it always came, it did not fall gently. It arrived as if summoned by the road's own memory of suffering, as though the sky had tired of watching and decided to reach down, flattening everything beneath sheets of gray. The road, already fragile, already wounded from centuries of use and neglect, yielded to it without resistance. Mud rose like bread left too long by the fire. Stones vanished beneath puddles too deep to judge. Ruts filled with water and became rivers of their own. For a traveler, there was no escaping it. Cloaks soaked through within minutes. Wool, meant to insulate, turned heavy and cold. Boots filled with sludge, each step attested with more than strength. And the rain touched everything. Your food, your coin, your spirits. Letters smudged beyond recognition. Maps bled ink until the forests and villages became pools of blue and black. Some roads simply disappeared, not in metaphor, but in fact. Paths that had been visible in dry weather became indistinguishable from the fields around them. Crossings vanished beneath water. Bridges, built of rotten wood and good intentions, collapsed with the weight of their own regrets. You did not walk in the rain. You navigated like a ship on a sinking sea. And it was not just discomfort. It was danger. The mud swallowed wheels. Horses slipped and shattered their legs. Wagons broke, their contents ruined, left behind in sorrowful piles that steam rose from like smoke. Every step became a gamble. Every descent threatened to become a fall. Hillsides crumbled. Trees, soaked too long, gave up and fell across the path with a crack that echoed like thunder. And still you moved, because the rain did not stop. Not after an hour. Not after a day. Sometimes it went on for weeks, and what was once a journey became a slow drowning, not in water, but in weight. The weight of wet clothes, of ruined supplies, of days lost and distances stretched by detours that led only to more water, more rot, more failure. Villages along the road closed their gates. No room, they said, and meant it. The earth in their fields could no longer hold more feet. The roofs of their homes already dripped, and they feared, rightly, that with the rain came sickness, lung rot, fevers, rashes from the wet that burrowed into flesh like worms. Travelers carried more than goods. They carried the smell of the world breaking down. And when the sky finally cleared, what was left behind was not relief, but silence. The road had changed. What was firm was now soft. What was visible was now hidden. Whole stretches became impassable. Others turned unfamiliar, altered by landslides or rising water. You did not walk the same way again. Even if your feet remembered the path, the ground did not. Some learned to predict the worst of it. They watched the birds, the winds, the aches in their joints. But prediction was not protection. You could not argue with the sky. You could only endure, or not. And so the road reshaped itself, slowly and without apology. It became longer where it once was short. It bent where it once went straight. And every traveler who passed after the rain walked not just through water, but through the ruins of someone else's attempt. Footprints led nowhere. Markers were gone. Only the deep grooves of carts that didn't make it told the story of those who had tried and failed. And still, forward was the only direction left. And after the rain, when everything was soaked beyond reason and breath steamed out in slow, ghost-like trails, came the worst kind of night. A night without fire. Not for lack of need, but for lack of flame. The wood was wet to flint dull, and even hope felt too damned to catch. The sky above was black without stars, the moon veiled in a constant, shifting mist. The air carried a kind of weight, not heavy exactly, but hollow, as if the world itself had been emptied of warmth. Fires were more than heat on the road. They were protection, a circle of light against what pressed in from the woods, a place where faces became human again and shadows lost their teeth. But without fire there was only cold. Cold that climbed inside sleeves and spread beneath the skin like slow poison. Cold that turned fingers stiff, that made mouths forget how to speak. Cold that watched from every direction and never blinked. Those who traveled in groups huddled close, but even the shared body heat was fleeting. Wet wool gave no comfort. Leaking tents sagged under the weight of mist. And those who tried to brave it alone quickly learned the quiet panic of darkness that offered no end, no shape, no edge. Eyes strained against it. Ears invented sounds. Every shift of leaves became a footstep. Every creak of branch, a breath too close. Some tried to light a flame anyway. Flint sparked, tinder hissed, but the wood, soaked through and swollen, only smoked and sputtered, refusing to catch. The effort wasted what little dry rags they had left, and so they sat in silence in the pitch, remembering the warmth of fire not as a certainty, but as a luxury they had once known. In the absence of light, imagination grew louder. Travelers thought of wolves, of course, of thieves drawn to the sound of breathing in the dark. But worse still were the thoughts that didn't need a body. The thought that maybe the road had no end, that maybe this was the last place you would ever stop, that you'd fall asleep like this, shivering, vision full of black, and simply never wake. And there were those who didn't. The old, the frail, those already weakened by days of walking, by rain, by hunger. Coal was an honest killer. It needed no blade, only time. And the road offered it freely, again and again. When morning came, if it came gray, without warmth, without welcome. The sky remained a solid lid, sealing in the damp. There was no sunrise, only a gradual change in tone, like the dimmest candle lit behind a curtain. And those who had endured the night rose slowly, their joints aching, their movements dull. They said little. They packed without thought. They walked because standing still felt like inviting the cold back in, and if they passed the place again, days or weeks later, they would not recognize it, because the night had claimed it, made it something different, a place where breath had fogged the air and disappeared into nothing, a place where, just once, there had been no fire. And when the light finally returned, dim and unsatisfying though it was, it revealed what the dark had hidden, or perhaps what the dark had protected the traveler from seeing. The bones, not buried, not hidden beneath leaves or tucked beneath stone, but out in the open, scattered, washed clean by the rain, sun-bleached and smooth, like pebbles laid by an invisible hand. Not one or two, not the remains of a single tragedy, but many, too many to explain away. They weren't always human. Some were clearly animal. Thin ribs, curved spines, the shattered remnants of beasts too broken to continue. But others bore the unmistakable shape of hands, of skulls split clean along their crown, of femurs too long and too heavy to have ever belonged to anything but a man. There was no blood that had long ago soaked into the soil and become memory. Only the bones remained, silent, indifferent, unclaimed. They were not placed in ritual. This was not the careful stacking of a churchyard or a battlefield burial. These were the bones of the forgotten, left where they fell, slowly becoming part of the very path itself. And over time, the road absorbed them. Carts rattled over them. Boots crushed them into dust. Wheels ground them flatter and flatter until they were less than gravel. The road did not discriminate. It accepted everything given to it. The locals knew the spots. They had names for them. Whisper Hollow, Bleeder's Bend, the Dead Mile. Places where, even on sunny days, no birds landed. Where the trees grew crooked and thin, their roots unwilling to stretch too deep. Where even moss avoided the ground. Travelers did not rest in these places. They did not light fires. They did not linger. If the hour grew late and the next village still lay far ahead, they walked faster, whispering prayers they had not spoken since childhood. There were stories, of course. There are always stories. Some said a great battle had once been fought there. Others claimed it was a place of execution, a forgotten crossroads where thieves were hanged and their bodies left to rot as warnings. But the truth, if there was one, was quieter and worse. It was a place where people simply died. Not all at once, not in great numbers, but slowly, over time, starved, hunted, abandoned, lost, one by one, until the land no longer cared who they were. Sometimes, a traveler would stop, foolishly, curiously, and kneel beside a fragment, lift a small bone, run their thumb over the smooth edge. It was always lighter than expected, fragile, and in that fragility lay the warning. Because whatever had happened here, whatever had reduced flesh to silence, had not left loudly. It had slipped away without a name. There were no markers, no crosses, no memories, only the crunch of bone beneath wheels. the faint wind that passed without sound, and the knowing glance shared between those who had seen such places before and would again. And so they moved on, not because they were unafraid, but because there was nothing else to do. The road did not pause for grief. It did not mark its own dead. It simply swallowed them, piece by piece, mile by mile, until even the bones became part of the path. And as the road stretched on, it shaped more memory than certainty. Travelers clung to whatever tools they had to make sense of it. Chief among them, the map, folded parchment, stained with sweat and soot, its lines traced with careful ink or crude charcoal, names of villages, distances between forks, sketches of rivers and bridges, a promise, however faint, that someone had gone before and returned to tell the way. But the road cared little for maps. And the truth, often learned too late, was that maps lied. Not all lies were malicious. Some were simply outdated, drawn in warmer seasons, before the flood took the bridge or the hill collapsed. Others were made by hands that had never touched the dirt, scribes in far-off cities working from memory or rumor, sketching roads they'd never seen. But a lie, whether born from ignorance or intent, carried the same weight in the wild. Misdirection, delay, danger. You would follow the line on the map, expecting a fork to appear, only to find yourself waist-deep in a marsh that wasn't supposed to exist, or a town marked neatly in bold letters. Orlon's Rest, perhaps, will be nothing more than a ring of scorched wood and wind-blown ash, its people gone, its name whispered only by crows. Roads shown as solid lines were sometimes dreams. They bent in ways that paper did not. They disappeared into woods that had reclaimed what men once built. Some maps lied with intention. A kingdom wishing to protect its borders might redraw the land to mislead enemies, turning a straight road into a maze. A merchant might exaggerate the length of a competitor's route, or erase a shortcut entirely. Even travelers made their own false additions. Safe well here, they might write, beside a place where nothing lived, not to harm, but to comfort themselves, to leave behind the illusion of order. And those who depended on maps too much often suffered the most, because the road shifted with the seasons, with the moods of the land, with the weight of time. It cracked, it split, it healed in the wrong places. And if you walked with only a map in hand and no instinct in your bones, you would walk in circles. Or worse, you would walk straight into places no one had dared map at all. Veteran travelers learned to treat maps not as truth, but as suggestion, a collection of hopeful lies wrapped in familiar folds. They watched the wind instead, the curve of trees, the shape of stone. They asked questions in taverns, traded rumors like coin, and trusted the instinct of animals more than the ink of cartographers. A dog turning from a trail meant more than 5 lines on a page. Even those who made the maps, if they ever returned, admitted to their failure. It was correct when I drew it, they'd say. The road must have changed. And no one argued, because it was true. Roads did change. Not always in grand ways, not always by storm or war. Sometimes they simply faded, forgotten by all but the roots that split their stones. Sometimes they twisted just enough to lead the hopeful astray. And so, when night fell and the fire was too small to warm your hands, you'd unfold the map once more, not to learn but to remember, to see the shapes, the promises, the paths that never quite matched the mud on your boots. You would trace the line from where you'd started to where you sat now, and realize how little they connected. And in the morning, you would put the map away, not because it had betrayed you, but because the road would tell you where to go next, whether you liked it or not. And as the road twisted deeper into forgotten corners of the land, there came places where it simply stopped. Not in a clear end, not at a city gate or sea's edge, but in silence. A trail that faded into grass. A bridge half-built and long abandoned. A fork that led into woods so dark and dense that even daylight bent away. These were the places the road refused to cross. Places that had pushed back against paths, against maps, against men. They were not marked. No stones warned of danger. No signs bore words of caution. Yet everyone who reached them felt the same pause, a hush that fell without sound, a heaviness in chest, as though breath itself knew better than to be taken there. Horses balked. Children cried. Even the wind seemed to go around. Some said it was nature reclaiming its ground, that the bogs swallowed planks and the trees snapped the bones of bridges with patient roots, that rain and rot had done what no war could. But others believed in older things, that there were lands a road had once dared cross but had been turned away by forces with no name, curses that broke carts and chilled blood, spirits that walked faster than feet and whispered louder than boots, stories not told in cities but murmured in fields where scarecrows leaned too long in one direction. Travelers did not camp there. They turned back, even when time was tight and coin was low. They would rather add days to their journey than cut through a mile of silence, because these were places without memory. No birds nested there. No insects sang. No ruins stood to tell what came before. Only the remains of failed crossings, half-sunken wagons, rusted axles, wheels splintered and overgrown with moss. And always, just past the edge where the road stopped, there would be something unnatural. A well too perfect in shape. A tree growing sideways. A patch of ground that never held water, even in rain. And no matter how brave the traveler, how tired, how desperate, they would not go further, not out of superstition, but because the road itself had chosen to end there, as if it had spoken, "This is not our place." Even armies in older times had learned the hard way, marches that vanished without sound, columns that never reached the next hill, a commander's map inked with confidence. His campfires later found coal beside empty armor, and though kings never admitted it, the peasants did. They knew. The road turned back, they'd say, with a shrug and a glance to the edge of the woods. And so should you. Some tried to build through. New bridges, new paths. They rarely lasted, would rotted faster. Stones sank overnight. The air grew thicker the deeper you worked, like breathing through cloth. Even animals refused to graze near the edges. The land had made its decision. And so, over time, the road respected those refusals. It wound wider. It climbed steeper. It bent with unnatural patience just to avoid a single patch of land. And in those detours was a kind of understanding, a pact, old and unspoken, that there are places meant to be left alone, places where the weight of something unknown was too much for wagons and wheels and weary feet. So the road, stubborn as it was, did what few humans ever could. It listened, it stepped back, and in that pause, it whispered not defeat, but wisdom. Not every path is meant to be taken. And for those who pressed on, who bent with the road's every whim, who passed the drowned bridges, the crooked ends, the miles of bone in silence, there eventually came what they had long imagined as the end. A town, perhaps, or the sea, a cathedral rising out of fog, a walled city with a name whispered since childhood, something that would signal the journey was over, that the road had fulfilled its promise. But when it came, it never felt like arrival. There was no cheer, no music, no relief waiting in the square. The town might have been real enough, its streets paved, its markets noisy, but to the traveler it seemed hollow, not because it lacked beauty, but because it was not the version they had carried in their mind across the endless miles. The body arrived before the heart did. The feet stepped into new dust, but the mind still lingered behind. In the forest where no bird sang, on the hill where bones cracked underfoot, in the tavern where sleep never came. And so the road was never truly behind them. It clung, it echoed, it breathed within the folds of clothes, the ache of knees, the silence that replaced once bright conversation. They looked around and realized something bitter. No one in the destination knew what they had endured to arrive. No one asked how many nights without fire. No one counted the blisters or named the faces left behind. To the people in the city, they were just another arrival, another pair of boots on cobblestone, another coin in the innkeeper's hand. And in that indifference was the cruelest truth. The journey, which had demanded everything, ended not with celebration, but with transaction. A rented room, a bowl of soup, a glance from a stranger. There was no moment when the road said, "You made it." It simply ended, or rather it faded, replaced by noise and stone and the strange quiet of a place where no one knew your name. And for some, that was too much. They stayed only a night, maybe two, before turning back. not to retrace their steps, but to feel again the certainty of movement, because the road, for all its coldness and cruelty, had given something the city could not: direction. On the road, each day had meaning, each step a demand. But here, at the supposed end, there was only choice. And that was harder to bear than hunger. Others tried to forget. They worked, married, grew still. But late at night, when wind rattled shutters and the smell of rain returned to the air, the road called again, not as a voice, but as a feeling, a tension in the chest, a flicker of motion in the dark corner of the mind, not a memory, a presence, because the road did not end. Not really. It only paused. It wove through lives like thread through cloth, changing shape but never leaving. And those who had truly walked it carried it always, in their limbs, in their silence, in the way they stared at the horizon just a little too long. And so, the end was never an end. It was a place between beginnings, a stop, a breath, and beyond it, though maps might fade and names might change, the road waited still. And after all the miles, all the mud and silence and sleepless nights, after the cruel inns and the voices that lived in the trees, after the bones that lined the way and the fires that never lit, the road itself remained, not just beneath your feet, but around you, in the shape of your thoughts, in the rhythm of your steps, long after the walking had stopped. It had taken much from you, time, blood, hope, and it had given little back. But what it gave, it kept, because the road remembered. It remembered the weight of every cart that creaked under soaked grain or broken children. It remembered the boots that pressed it flat again and again until the earth itself learned the names of their wearers. It remembered screams left behind in ditches and prayers spoken softly at turns where no one else had survived. It remembered each time someone stopped to breathe, to cry, to kneel, not in weakness, but in reverence of the sheer length of what still lay ahead. The road bore no grudge. It did not pity. It simply absorbed. Every footstep became part of its skin. Every story, whether told or lost, remained in the dust. And though no stone spoke, no tree leaned down to explain, those who had walked long enough knew. The road was alive with memory. You could feel it in places where the wind shifted without reason, where the ground still felt warm from long-gone fire, where laughter echoed faintly though the air was still. The road did not speak, but it listened, and in its silence, it held a record more faithful than any scribe. It remembered those who had tried to conquer it, kings with armies, merchants with gold, pilgrims with desperate eyes. It had seen their triumphs, their deaths, their regrets. It had outlasted every oath. It had welcomed every exile. It had buried every lie. And still it ran forward, indifferent, enduring. Even those who walked it only once left something behind. A breath, a fear, a choice. The road did not forget. And when others followed, years later, centuries later, they would feel it, a weight in the spine, a turn that made no sense on a map, but felt necessary all the same. That was the road remembering, not in anger, in presence. And those who truly understood, those who had not just walked the road but been changed by it, carried its memory with them forever, in how they paused before thresholds, in how they watched the sky before stepping into rain, in how they sat by fires, always leaving room for someone unseen. Because the road did not end at a city gate or the sea's edge. It continued in every foot that walked again, in every tale passed across the smoke of a hearth, in every map that failed, and every story told anyway. The road remembered, quietly, completely, and so, through those who walked it, it would never be forgotten,